Greetings. Our most recent assignment asks us to present our line of reasoning for or against ability-based instruction. The following information I will give you is my stance, which is for ability-based grouping. And the information that I have is based upon current research that I've looked up, information and insight from myself, my education, and then personal experience as well. I think it's important to look at the historical perspectives of ability grouping because certainly in the 1990s it was an enormous issue, and many people believed that ability grouping was discriminatory. In fact, many people believed that ability grouping was being done based upon minorities or socioeconomic status, which reasonably would be something that Brown versus Board of Education indicated is not appropriate. Certainly these individuals felt as though we were basically creating another situation of separate but equal, except they felt like those ability group classrooms, especially for the lower group, were not equal. So the two main issues that I want to hit on in relation to ability grouping, I know there's lots of arguments against ability grouping, but a couple of the ones that I seem to continually see in the research were the issue of ability group students being discriminatory as a result of the lower level classes believed to contain students from lower socioeconomic statuses. And then also the concern that students would not make adequate academic progress in these different leveled courses. So the first one is the issue of discriminatory classrooms. And I was able to read a study by Ross, Smith, Lohr, and McNeils, which was published in 1994. And they actually did a comparison of different classrooms. They looked at math and reading, and so obviously when they looked at those two classes, those classrooms were much different. However, the classes that were ability grouped between the math or between the reading proved to be very similar. They had very similar class structures, similar amounts of students, similar types of students. The teachers had similar educations, and they also rated the teacher's opinion of the classroom and the classroom environment, and for the most part those were similar as well. There was one significant difference between the two sets of classrooms, which I will quote for you what they stated. The remedial classrooms demonstrated that remedial teachers were more likely than regular teachers to rate students as poor test takers, as having difficulty with self-control, as being more aggressive toward one another, as having short attention spans, and as having poor classroom attendance. So I think that when we hear that issue, it's important for us to remember that we are not grouping students based solely on their socioeconomic status. I think that although I'm for the ability grouping, I think there's a right way to do it and there's a wrong way to do it. And I think that in order to do it appropriately, we have to use more than one assessment to allow these students to be ability grouped. So we're not going to use a single cognitive assessment. We're not going to use a single MAP score or a STAR score in order to place the students. We need to use cumulative data in order to say this is where the students' instructional level is. I also think that we need to provide the students an opportunity to move through those levels of grouping, because a student may have an excellent skill. We know them. We know there's students who might be very fluent readers but are really struggling with reading comprehension. So reading as a whole, we don't want to loop them into just a group of students who are at the lower level or the students who are more advanced, because there will be particular skills where that student might struggle or they might excel. So I think that throughout our lessons there needs to be opportunities and consistent data monitoring for us to evaluate where that student belongs in that continuum of groups. I also think that it's important to understand the cultural differences that we have. Certainly I work in an area where we have lots of poverty, and I know there are many students who come to school and they're simply not ready to learn. We don't know what that student has gone through. Some of these students don't have air conditioning or heat in their homes. They don't have running water. Many of them are caregivers for their younger siblings. So at a very young age, they're responsible not only for themselves, but also for their younger siblings. They may not have food in the home. So when the student comes to school, it may be a situation where they're more worried about, okay, what's going to happen when I get home? Maybe this morning was really terrible and that's been a rough situation for them. So I think that it's important for us to understand that students are coming from many different backgrounds that might affect their learning. So I just hope that people understand it's not that we are grouping students intentionally that way. We have to think about what came first. I think oftentimes we see students who have a lower socioeconomic status or minorities simply end up having more difficulties with education because it's very hard for them to focus on those things. We know that as educators, students have to have their basic needs met first in order for them to be ready to learn. So another issue that I wanted to address was that of adequate academic progress. I think that one of the things that individuals who disagree with ability grouping feel as though they will not see the improvement in students. I was able to read another study for this from Matthews, hopefully I'm pronouncing this right, Ricciotti, and McBay. And those individuals cite numerous studies in their literature review which have found that ability grouping benefits students at all ability levels. Their record review also indicated that students in low and high ability groups made academic gains when grouped similarly. So then their own research indicated that related to reading, both groups showed similar rates of growth. I think it's important with this study to note that the school was doing a normal inclusive structure, and then they switched for 1 year to this ability grouping. So that's when researchers got on board to take a look at them. And then the next year, the school actually switched back to the typical inclusion. Now, it has nothing to do with the progress the students made. What actually happened was parents were so upset that their students were in the lower level that administrators chose to simply forego using the ability grouping. So I think that's another cultural issue that we have to face. We need to educate parents and other teachers that students need to be taught at their ability level in order to allow them to progress in their education. I think that's simply a stigma that we have right now with a lower level class versus an upper level class. And then I'll briefly talk about my personal experience on this issue and some information that I have as well from just prior studies. I know I had the opportunity to participate in some extra education. It was outside of the school day, but being able to do that was a nice creative outlet. It made it easier for me to go through school. On the other side of the spectrum, I also got to experience a poor implementation of some ability grouping. With that, it was our math classes, and in high school, we simply took a test, and that dumped us into either the advanced track or the typical track. I made the advanced track by 1 point, and so I got to experience being that student in the classroom who's always behind. It was very frustrating. I required a lot of teacher assistance, a lot of assistance from my peers, and oftentimes things would be explained to me and I would finally understand the concepts 2 units later. So it was a very frustrating situation for me, and I feel like that could have been implemented much better because there were concepts that I caught on to very quickly and was right with my peers, but the majority of them I needed additional assistance and probably would have benefited more and had a much better experience with my math if I had been able to make more of the regular track. Another point that I want to make in terms of thinking about ability grouping is obviously we need to understand that our students who are functioning a little bit lower in the classrooms need a different style of education. They need different information presented in different ways. We also have students who are excelling in those classes who really need a creative push. They need some more information because they're sitting in the classroom's bored. And as the video that we watched before we started the assignment will show you, those students feel like they want to be challenged in their classes and are disappointed that they're not. So I wanted to point out, and hopefully you're able to see this on the camera. This is a normal curve. So I think it's important to note that in the blue here, that's where we have our average performing students. Then when we look at the pink area that's highlighted here, that's going to be 1 standard deviation below the mean. So those are our students who are struggling. Then when we look at the other pink side, those are our students who are going to be gifted. So when we look at the IQ range, we see that average runs from 85 all the way to 115. So what I'm trying to point out with that graph is simply that our students who are functioning lower, who we already serve through pull-out or through additional groups or additional information, additional interventions, they're being served because they need that help, because it's not effective for them to be in the typical classroom. I think we have to understand that our gifted students are exactly the same difference between our normal group, just on the other end of the spectrum. So we have to consider that it's equally as difficult for those students to sit through those classes, knowing that they're not being challenged appropriately. So I apologize for the length, but I appreciate you listening. Thank you.